Today I'm out here in Southern California taking a look at the all-new 2020 Nissan Sentra. This is also known worldwide as the Sunny and the Selfie. Nissan tells us that the Sentra is the single best-selling nameplate in their history in America. Now, obviously, this is not the best-selling vehicle in Nissan's portfolio at the moment. That award would go to the Nissan Rogue. But the Sentra is still a very key model to the range. They sell about 200,000 of these annually in America. And according to not just Nissan, but also Hyundai, Honda, and Toyota, about 8 in 10 shoppers are considering sedans for their next vehicle, and that's exactly why Nissan has doubled down on the things that compact shoppers are looking for: fuel economy, sporty driving dynamics, and definitely a better looking exterior. While other car companies are trying to design their models to look a little bit different, Nissan is definitely sticking with the family design language. So this looks definitely like a scale model of the Versa that's smaller than this and the Altima that's a little bit larger. But I think the overall proportions definitely work best on the Sentra. This is a little bit wider than the last generation model, also helping out with that overall proportion balance. The front end looks very much like the Altima with a strong chrome bar that runs right across the front, radar sensor right there behind the Nissan logo, and then the optional LED headlamps, but you'll only find these in the top trims. Be sure and let me know what you think about the overall look of the Sentra down there in the comment section below. To my eye, this is one of the most attractive entries in this segment. I really love the value proposition in the Civic. I love the 1.5-liter turbo and the way that it drives, but I think this is a little bit more attractive. Now, I think the prettiest entry in this segment is the Mazda 3 currently, so let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. This generation Sentra rides on an all-new platform. That's a little bit surprising because Nissan could have just shrunken down the Altima, but instead they've decided to give us an all-new platform for their compact sedan. This is a little bit longer than the last generation model, with a slightly longer wheelbase as well. This is 182.7 inches long, putting this sort of in the middle of the compact sedan segment. This is about 6 inches longer than the Hyundai Ioniq, which you could include in this segment, but about 2 inches shorter than the Volkswagen Jetta. From this angle, you can see that they've also lowered the roofline a little bit. That helps the overall proportions out on the Sentra, but it does mean that we're going to find less headroom in the back than previous generations of the Sentra in America. We have this two-tone paint scheme on this particular model with this floating roof design right back here that some people love or hate. Again, let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below as well. I have to say that it does not bother me at all in the two-tone versions, where it's black on top and this copper orange color below. That floating roofline just blends right in with the roof section right there. Now, because this is not quite as long as some of the entries in this segment, there are a few compromises, but that mainly happens back there in the trunk. Moving to the rear, we again find a scale model version of the rest of Nissan's lineup. The tail lamp modules are very similar to what we see in the Altima and Versa, slightly differently styled in this model, of course. But the big thing to note is that these are not LEDs like we do find in some of the competition. These are incandescent bulbs only, even in the top-end SR trim. Now, the big reason for that, of course, is the base sticker price of the Sentra. This is one of the least expensive entries in this segment and probably the best value in this segment, unless you need all-wheel drive. Then there is that Subaru Impreza. The SR trim is the sporty trim theoretically, so we get this little lip spoiler right here on the trunk lid, but we don't get any extra power under the hood. The other way to tell the SR apart is this chrome exhaust tip right down there at the bottom of the bumper. You don't find that in the other trims. With active safety being all the rage, Nissan has tossed a load of active safety tech on all models of the Sentra, including the base S trim. That includes low-speed autonomous braking with pedestrian detection, blind spot monitoring with rear cross-traffic detection, and rear parking sensors with rear autonomous braking as well. Blind spot monitoring and rear cross-traffic detection are things that we don't find on base models of the competition, and the rear autonomous braking is something that we don't find on most of the competition at all. One thing that surprised me is that radar adaptive cruise control is not standard on the Sentra, even though that radar sensor up front is, in order to enable the pedestrian detection. You will find radar adaptive cruise control available in upper level trims, but it's not going to be on that base S model, and you will find it on base Corollas and base Civics as well. Under the hood, there's just one engine in America. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, essentially borrowed out of the Rogue Sport and then tweaked a little bit for use in the Sentra. This produces 149 horsepower and 146 pound-feet of torque. The last generation Sentra had an optional 1.6-liter turbo, but that engine is gone, at least for the moment. Nissan won't talk about any future engines available in this model. Also gone is the manual transmission, so the only transmission on offer is a continuously variable model that will give you up to 33 miles per gallon combined in most trims of this. If you do get the SR trim, then you lose 1 mpg in the combined cycle. I know a lot of folks out there aren't huge CVT fans, but there's some really good reasons why we find CVTs in just about every entry in this segment, with really only 3 exceptions. The Mazda 3, which uses an older 6-speed automatic transmission, the Jetta, which uses a relatively modern 8-speed, and then of course the Ioniq, which uses a 6-speed DCT and a hybrid system. When you're trying to motivate just over 3,000 pounds with just under 150 horsepower, a CVT is going to give you the best fuel economy and the best acceleration, and that's really why we find them in just about every compact car in America. Hopping into the front seat, you'll immediately notice that these seats are definitely more comfortable than the outgoing Sentra model. This was one of the last Nissans to receive their new zero-gravity seat design, and that really has a positive impact on front seat comfort. We have a tilt-telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion, and a power driver's seat here with a two-position lumbar support, but the front of the seat does not move independently of the back. It just sort of moves in a single-hinged fashion. Now, it's worth noting that the front passenger seat is not powered in any trim of the Sentra, and it does feel quite a bit higher off the ground than the driver's seat. It's something that I noticed when driving this and then sitting in the passenger seat as well. The driver's seat is a really comfortable low feeling, which I prefer in a modern sedan like this, whereas the passenger seat definitely feels considerably higher off the ground. Hopping into the back seat, we have a large amount of legroom, really a surprising amount of legroom for a compact sedan. This actually has a little bit more legroom than some mid-size sedans in America. You can see sitting right here behind myself with the front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have about 4 or 5 inches of legroom left. Headroom is also better than I had expected. My head does touch the ceiling back here, but I could almost sit very upright. Now, as we've seen in other sedans in America, sedans have become swoopier, sexier as sedan shoppers that have families and taller people sitting in the back have moved to crossovers. That just seems to be a fact of life. But this doesn't seem to have shrunk quite as much as others. And here in the middle seat, you can see that I still have just a little bit of headroom left right there. Moving all the way over to the right side of the cabin, the front seat was further back in its tracks. So you can see that legroom is still pretty generous. Rear seat passengers in this trim get a fold-down center armrest with 2 cup holders right there, and the rear seats do fold in a 60-40 fashion. Although the interior is unexpectedly generous in this Sentra, the trunk is a little bit smaller than before, at just over 14 cubic feet back here. The Sentra, the Versa, the Altima had long been known for really large and accommodating trunks, and I'm sad to say that that trend with Nissan seems to be going the other way now, because we can no longer put a 22-inch roller bag like this in this vertical position and still close the trunk lid, and we could do that in the previous generation Versa, Altima, and the Sentra as well. Nissan has kept the hinges tucked pretty well to the sides. That helps you put larger cargo back there, but it's still not going to be quite as large as the previous Sentra, or of course, some of the hatchbacks in this segment. Taking a quick spin around the interior, the model that we're driving has a pretty standard sized moonroof that goes just over the driver and front passengers' heads right there. We also have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger. That's Sophie and Bay from Redline Reviews right back there in the rear seat. Wave. There we go. Height adjustable shoulder belts, and we are driving the SR trim, so we have these orange accents right here in the middle and then orange stitching around the seat design. These seats are a combination of leather and fabric, so we have a little fabric insert right here around the shoulder area and then leather for the facing of the seat. As I noted before, the front seats are a little bit different on the driver and front passenger side. The passenger seat does appear to be a little bit higher off the ground, but interior parts quality is surprisingly high in here, and I actually think we have a slightly more premium interior here than we find in the 2020 Civic. Now remember that the basics of the Civic are getting a little bit old. It was first launched back in 2016, so it is several years old at this point. That level of attention to detail and parts quality continues as we move on over to the dashboard, where we find this stitched upper section right here. Hard plastics lower, just as you'd expect in any compact sedan in America, and then a slightly smaller glove compartment than I had expected. I don't know if I'd be able to fit a large tablet computer inside. Zooming out from there, you can see that we have an overall dashboard style that reminds me an awful lot of the Kia Stinger, with this infotainment screen perched high on the dashboard and then these 3 large air vents right here in the middle. The closures for those air vents are right there. We just turn the knob on the inside. Now, this is not the standard infotainment system. This is the optional one. There is a 7-inch system standard. The 8-inch is optional, and that's where we find Apple CarPlay and Android Auto support. Below the air vents, we find the optional dual-zone automatic climate control, USB inputs right there, a standard USB and a USB-C input, 12-volt power port right over there. The engine start-stop button over here if you get the keyless ignition in the Sentra. The shifter is a pretty traditional console shifter. This is the sport mode button right there on the back of the shifter. It's pretty discreet. And then we have drive and then low. 2 decently sized cup holders right there between the front seats. I suspect these will easily be able to accommodate large takeout drinks. Also between the front seats is a softly padded armrest that opens in one motion to reveal a pretty deep storage compartment. I suspect you'd definitely be able to fit something like a gallon of milk in there. This model has one of Nissan's partial LCD instrument cluster, but it's not the same one that we see in Nissan's less expensive models. Interestingly enough, this seems to be more aligned with the larger Nissans in America. So we have a physical speedometer and tachometer, and then that color multifunction display right there in the middle. The display is controlled via the multifunction buttons on the steering wheel. As you can see, we get things like trip computer readouts, the status of the vehicle's active safety systems, ability to change certain vehicle settings, etc. The steering wheel is one of Nissan's new flat bottom designs, which I have to say is a very attractive look overall. We have sport grips up top, and you generally don't find this kind of sporty steering wheel in the average compact sedan in America. You'll find the controls for the optional radar adaptive cruise control over here on the right, and then they've divorced some of the infotainment buttons, so we have voice command and then the phone button over here on the right, track forward, backward, and volume control on the left. This is the multifunction control that controls that multifunction LCD. If you get the SV trim with the premium package option, then we get upgraded leather on the interior. There's a perforated section right there on the side bolsters. All of these seats are not ventilated, they are heated. If we move on over to the doors, you can see this two-tone color scheme continues, and that continues on over to the dashboard as well, where this upper injection molded section that's been after stitched is now tan or brown. But the bulk of the dashboard remains the same as before. Now, there are a few oddities here in the SV Premium trim. For instance, no heated steering wheel in SV Premium, but you do find that in SR. In case you're wondering, there is still no wireless charging mat right there in the center console. It's also worth noting that the SV with Premium package is a little bit less expensive than the very top-end versions of the SR. We have the same instrument cluster over here on the driver's side, and basically the same steering wheel as well. Flat bottom even in this trim. Out on the road, you probably won't notice the extra power that we get in this generation of Sentra, but you really will notice the different suspension tune. This certainly feels an awful lot sportier than the last model. The suspension is significantly firmer, in my opinion, than the last generation Sentra, so some folks won't like that if you're after a really serene driving experience, but if you're going to take your Sentra out on the winding mountain roads around here in California, then this is definitely going to be something that you're going to want. This doesn't remind me exactly of the Honda Civic, but it's certainly more in that vein than it ever has been before. This reminds me an awful lot of the current generation Toyota Corolla. And although some folks may laugh at that, being reminded of the current Corolla is not really a bad thing at all, because the Corolla has really turned over a new leaf with this generation, and it's focused much more on handling than it ever has been before. Nissan tells us that they've updated their CVT, so even though this uses the same basic design principles as the last generation Sentra, it is a slightly different unit. And they've given it, again, their D-step system, which tries to imitate an automatic transmission. I honestly wish they didn't do that because the shifts don't feel quite right. They feel a little bit mushy, a little bit slow compared to something like the Volkswagen Jetta's automatic transmission that uses a brand new Aisin 8-speed, which is an absolutely excellent design, and this just doesn't have that same sort of engaging feel. That said, Nissan has definitely refined their CVT over time, and again, CVTs in this segment are pretty much the standard transmission. So they're here because this gives us better overall acceleration and better overall fuel economy than if they were to use a transmission of a different design or a manual transmission. Now that said, it is worth noting that in terms of 0 to 60 acceleration times, your best 0 to 60 times are going to be when the transmission is not imitating shifts. Like other Nissan models, if you put this in low and then floor it from a dead stop, then it will just vary ratios like CVTs of old, and that's going to give you the best acceleration. Nissan has definitely kept the curb weight of the Sentra in check. This is still a little bit heavier than something like the Ioniq, but it is also a little bit larger. So this weighs just over 3,100 pounds in this particular trim, definitely in keeping with the bulk of the competition, and that really helps out handling out on these winding mountain roads. This particular model has 215 width tires. These are the widest tires you can find on a Sentra. That is worth noting because some of the competition will give you 225s or even 235s in some of the trims, but these are pretty similar to what we see in, for instance, the 2020 Mazda 3. When it comes to the overall handling ability, I have to say this reminds me a little bit of the current generation Mazda 3. The tire size is very similar. This is actually a little bit lighter than the Mazda 3, and we have that fully independent rear suspension, something that we no longer find in the Mazda. That means that this suspension feels a little bit better balanced in the rear. It doesn't seem to get as upset as the Mazda 3 suspension sometimes can, especially over rougher surfaces. Now obviously the Sentra still can't compete with the Mazda when it comes to overall steering feel. The Mazda is the clear winner in this segment. We just get a lot more information back from the front tires back to the driver, so you can have that more engaging driving experience out on the road. But when it comes to absolute grip, the Sentra does very, very well. And that's part of why we see this firmer suspension in this generation of the Sentra. We get a lot less body roll than before, a lot less tip and dive as well. This definitely feels more solid and more planted than something like the Elantra in regular form. The Elantra Sport is definitely going to be more engaging, but the regular Elantra I think falls a little bit behind this Sentra now. This also feels definitely more engaging than the hybrid options in this segment, like the Prius or of course the Hyundai Ioniq. You will of course have to wait until we can get this at home to give it our official 0 to 60, 60 to 0 braking scores and all those other scores, but I suspect this is probably going to come in right around 8 seconds or so 0 to 60, pretty similar to most of the competition. And again, we're talking about the base engine in the Honda Civic, not the 1.5 liter turbo. In terms of overall braking scores, I suspect this is going to be pretty comparable to the Mazda 3, which is to say, probably not quite as good as some versions of the Corolla, the Civic, and of course some of those other alternatives that use wider tires. Tire size has a big impact on overall braking distance, and these again do have 215 width tires on this model. Overall, out on the road, I have to say I'm pretty impressed. This definitely feels more polished than the last generation Sentra, including the Sentra SR Turbo. Now, we don't have the same kind of power under the hood that we found in that outgoing Sentra model, but the overall driving feel is definitely more premium and more sporty in this model. Now, Nissan won't tell us whether they plan to put a more powerful engine under the hood or not. I suspect it's not going to come, but I really hope that it does, because this chassis definitely has what it takes to handle probably about 200 horsepower and definitely be a very direct competitor to something like that Elante Sport. Nissan decided to keep their pricing pretty simple for 2020. This is more expensive than the outgoing Sentra model, and there are fewer trim levels to consider. This starts at $19,090 for the base S model, and if you get it fully equipped, which is the model that we're taking a look at here, this will be about $25,500. This paint scheme is optional, and then of course we have the optional premium package on the interior in this model as well. When you take a look at the feature list in the Sentra, this is very, very well equipped in the base model compared to most of the competition. Some of the key things are the active safety features that we get in this model, like the blind spot warning system, the rear parking sensors with rear autonomous braking, pedestrian detection, etc. We don't find that in all of the competition, but it is worth noting that we don't have radar adaptive cruise control in the Sentra, and you will find that in the base Toyota Corolla. I think that's a little bit of a surprising miss for Nissan here. I really wish this had that radar adaptive cruise control in all trims, because it would help that value proposition out even more. Even excluding that feature, however, this still stacks up incredibly well to entries like the Corolla and the Civic, as long as you're not looking for more power. More power is really what the Civic gives us in this segment, and that's why the Civic is one of my top picks in America for 2020. The Civic's infotainment system is certainly not as modern on the inside. I don't think it's quite as comfortable on the inside either, but the Civic is an awful lot of fun to drive, and that 1.5-liter turbo is surprisingly quick. As before, the Sentra is all about value, 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 and that is important to remember. Although the overall MSRP of the Sentra can be pretty comparable to some forms of the Corolla, the Civic, the Elantra, etc., remember that you're likely going to get a better deal on this on the Nissan dealer lot than you will on the Honda or the Toyota on their lots. That is something very important to keep in mind. This is going to sell at that greater discount, meaning it's going to be an even better value, even above the already good value that we see on the MSRPs. Now, I think an interesting option in this segment that I've mentioned before to a lot of folks out there that are looking for an inexpensive vehicle is the Hyundai Ioniq, because it's really inexpensive to operate. The Ioniq is going to give you about double the kind of cargo capacity we find back here. We lose a little bit of overall interior room, but you get about 60 miles per gallon out of that vehicle, and that's going to mean a fuel savings of $500 a year compared to this Sentra model. And if you live in California, that could be $600 or $700, depending on exactly how much you're paying for gas. Let me know down there if you would consider cross-shopping a hybrid to something like this Sentra. The Ioniq doesn't give up too much in terms of overall handling ability, especially if you look at the upper end trims. It's not going to feel quite as engaging as the Sentra, but it could save you an awful lot of cash. Let me know that down there in the comment section below. Also, let me know if you would be looking at a Sentra if you're shopping in the compact sedan segment. Be sure to check out all of our related videos on the channel. Head over to facebook.com/AlexNautis so you can see what we're driving this week. Find us on Instagram, Twitter, and all those other social things, and I'll see you next week.